encouraging pro-environmental.
Thank you. All right, yeah, so this is Green Eggs and Ham, a very long title for a very short talk. I'm going to talk to you today about a new project I've been working with Jason here, as well as with Dr. Vishu from the Mechanical and Industrial Engineering Department. I'm going to walk you through a couple of studies that we just recently conducted. Actually, the second one was, we got the data like last week, so it's much of a work in progress, and there's still work to be done, so any kind of future ideas or whatnot is very welcome. All right, so if you ever ate food, you probably know what calories are. And you imagine you pick up a box of cereal at the grocery store, and you look at the nutritional facts, and then you see the data on all the calories that are being consumed in Canada right now. And that wouldn't make a lot of sense. It wouldn't really inform you into future behavior. That's because we seek information that will inform our actions. And now imagine if you're interested not in how the product affects your body, but how the product affects the world, you don't have an equivalent calorie. You might have like a little symbol saying this is fair trade or please recycle. But usually when we seek information about the environment, we tend to see like gigantic numbers that don't really make sense to us. So researchers have identified this problem with communicating environmental issues. And overall, communication does tend to be cognitively abstract and occur in distant time and places, and involve probabilities and uncertainty, all things that really don't work well with our decision making. The aptly named term of climate change helplessness was recently termed by Solomon et al., and they I quote them, "The gravity of the threat may be too great for people to believe their actions matter." That is tragic. So let's say we manage to combat this helplessness, which is one of the reasons of this talk, of this project. Even if we do, what kind of actions should we communicate to people? Now, a recent paper looked at Canadian science textbooks and what kind of actions they recommend the future generation. And here on the x-axis, you can see the proportion of books that mention a specific action. But these actions, they are ranked from the most effective to the least effective in terms of how many carbon equivalent emissions you would save. Now, the number one behavior would be to have one fewer child. But this is not a talk about abortions. Instead, I'm focusing on a different high-impact behavior, eating a plant-based diet, which was not mentioned in a single Canadian high school textbook. But it is more effective than recycling, composting, hanging your clothes dry in the sun combined. So the reason that diet plays such a big role on the planet is because, first of all, because we eat a lot. And people in the Western society eat twice as much the recommended levels of beef. But the second reason is that this high level of consumption paired with the amount of resources that take to harvest meat is what makes this in a bigger proportion than most other behavior. So the inquiry on environmental vegetarianism is close to non-existent in social psychology, but there is a literature on vegetarianism that looked at moral aspect of consuming meat, pioneered by Paul Rosen in 1997. And even though the participants in his original studies cited ecological reasons as just as high as ethical reasons in choosing to be vegetarians, there really aren't many studies on this. Usually the studies in the literature focus on the meat paradox, which is the contradiction between how much we love animals and how much we love to eat them. Which leads us to this project. So the main thing I'm looking at is presenting this environmental information either in this national industry level, which will be, I use the symbol throughout the data, or presenting the same data adjusted for individual meals, which will be this little burger symbol throughout. The main question was to see, first of all, whether this nation or meal conditions would result in increased environmental concern and intentions to change diet. Second of all, we know that intentions don't always lead to behavior, so we wanted to check more longer lasting effects and whether we can measure actual behavior change. And third, we wanted to check the possibility that an established action planning intervention would strengthen such an effect. This is in study 2. Study 1 was an MTurk study that we took the demographics in the beginning, then presented a meat and the environment module, which I'll describe in a sec, and then collected dependent variables. The participants were 168 from the US. They had a slightly higher representation of females, as often happens in MTurk, and a slightly higher percentage of vegan or vegetarians, which is also representative of this part of the population. Now, meat and the environment module was the manipulation that we had in mind. Participants, regardless of condition, first saw an introduction about all those 3 different resources in randomized order. They would see, for example, what is, that's great, what is a water footprint. We'll get a little bit of an introduction that every product has a water footprint, And then they would see 1 of 2 versions of data. In the meal data, they would see the frame of reference as a single burger. It would be a single burger requires 400 gallons of water, which is equivalent to drinking water for 2 years. That's what they would see. Similar information about the CO2 equivalents that are released from this single meal, or the amount of grain that was used to feed the cows that would end up producing your burger. In the nation condition, we saw more traditional ways of presenting the extent that the industry is troubling to the environment, which is that 128 billion gallons of water are used in the meat industry every day, which is more than the number of stars in our galaxy, and things like that. For dependent variables, we have 2 different kinds of dependent variables. One is a subset of an established and recently validated measure that's called the meaning of food in life. The moral subset really talks about this connection between your diet and the environment. And a different set of dependent variables were what I call meat attachment, which is how important is meat in your diet. It's more about the connection between an individual and his diet, and not about the planet, let's say. Okay, so study 1, again, was a pretty straightforward t-testing, and we did see that there is a difference between the 2. So in the combined measure of the moral meaning of food in life, which was fairly consistent, we saw a small to moderate effect, such that those in the meal condition compared to the nation condition tended to see a higher connection between what they eat and the environment. Now, the meat attachment show an inverse relation, which is good because lower scores on this actually mean that you're less attached to meat. You think you're more willing to reconsider your diet. You think it's more avoidable. You think it's less important. So that was study 1, and we were quite pleased with this first study, and we wanted to test again the lasting effect the lasting effect of this intervention. So study 2 was a 5-day study, which had 3 main purposes. First, to replicate with an inclusion of a control condition, in order to see which condition actually changes the baseline endorsement of the moral subset. In addition, wanted to explore the possible lasting effect and try to get to actual behavior change. And in addition, to add a planning intervention, which is implementation intentions. I'm not going to discuss a couple of other possible moderators that we have in mind. We can talk about it in future directions, but it exists in the data, but haven't been analyzed yet. Implementation intentions, to those who don't know, it's a self-regulatory intervention that was pioneered by Peter Gollwitzer And it is shown to be an effective and very quick intervention for reducing this gap between intentions and behavior. There usually tend to be a medium effect size for different kind of behavior. Here I'm only showing about health behaviors from a recent meta-analysis. Most importantly, implementation intentions take the form of if-then. So if I will be presented with a certain obstacle, then I will do some concrete action to change that. And I based the wording on a recent application that the researchers Ottingen and Goldwitzer produced. It's a little cute app that lets you do those implementation intentions. But the way that I tested it in my studies was something like that. We asked them to make a small challenge of maybe reduce their meat consumption in the next few days. And then we asked them what is the greatest obstacle they would have. They would type, let's say, the department will cater the talk. Might be a problem, a situation that's hard to avoid eating meat in. So then they were, okay, this is my obstacle. How am I going to overcome it? I will ask Anne to order a vegetarian option, for example. I would have been given this plan to remember and type a couple of times so I could contemplate on it, and I was sent on my way with this plan. So the study was done also with mTurk worker sample, but using Turk prime, which really makes the process of collecting longitudinal data easy. People were recruited for a daily meet in the environment, so they knew that they're going to log in for 5 days, and they will be asked about their intake of different items. We limited it to US residents who had a certain approval rate and a certain amount of studies that they completed, and they were not part of study 1. The design was a 3x2 factorial design, because in addition to the mealination condition that we had before, we also had a control condition, and also because we wanted to test the implementation intentions, we had ended up having 6 cells that we were hoping to get 100% for each cell for an optimal kind of 0.9 power, but we agreed that 80 per cell would be reasonable as well, which is actually what we ended up managing to get. So in day 1, it was a quick survey, kind of demographics and attitudes towards the environment and towards meat, and kind of self-reported average meat consumption. Followed by 4 days, which they logged in. They had a certain amount of hours to log in and report their intake throughout the day. In day 3, in the middle of the survey of the study, they had the experimental conditions, 1 of 6, which, as I said earlier, in the meal condition, they would see the individual burger as a frame of reference. In the nation, they would see the beef industry as a frame of reference. The control just had nothing, actually, which we can discuss. Then they continued to implementation intention. And as I showed you, they produced this little plan, or as a control, they had they would write a couple of sentences about their day and how lovely it was without using some words to make it, I don't know, a bit of a more interesting exercise, I guess. So the dependent variable were, other than the intake, were collected in the end. We had the same kind of moral subset of the meaning of food in life questionnaire than from study 1. A slightly more objective measure of consumption was a subjective relative consumption, which was kind of their impression in the end of the experiment, whether this week they consumed less meat than usual, and even a slightly more objective measure of daily intake, which I will not present the data now. I'll show you kind of how it's going, and I'm hoping to get feedback on that. In the moral meaning of food in life, which is, I have one more thing to mention. How many we recruited, how many finished. We had similar demographics to the first study. And this is a database that I'll show you. I haven't, I haven't managed to merge all the different data sets. There are some participants that I'm still struggling with finding their data from past surveys. And in the studies where I'm measuring the actual behavior, I took off the vegetarians here, so that's the number we have. And the moral meaning of food in life, first of all, looking at our first prediction of wanting to replicate, we are seeing that without the implementation intentions, we see the same kind of effect, such that those in the nation condition score much lower points on this connection between their diet and the environment compared to control and to the meal. So we did get an idea that it's not the meal that kind of raises the concern, but it's the nation that kind of tunes you out, perhaps. We also, when we include all the different conditions, we have a very strong 3x2 interaction, such that it mostly is driven by the nation conditions, such that those who receive implementation intentions were, in the end, more, closer to the other conditions, and we didn't see this kind of tuning out. Again, slightly more objective measure was the subjective meat consumption, which looked something like that. It was a slider scale, and participants would say how much they consumed. This week, we combined those two scores. And here, negative numbers are actually what we were hoping to get. And we were assuming that everybody will have negative numbers, at least as a group mean, because, again, they were in an intervention and were contemplating their food choices. They kind of knew what it is about. If we, again, only look without the implementation intentions, we see a trend. It's not exactly how I wanted it. I'm hoping that this data, I have another 50 participants that I haven't managed to merge yet. Hope maybe we'll get to the level that we wanted. But we get kind of a mirror image of the early data I showed you, such that those in the industry condition are much closer to the control than they are to the meal, who showed a more definite reduction in how much meat they consume. And again, if we add all the conditions, we see like a very strong effect of implementation intention, which is great, because they did make the challenge, like we asked them specifically to reduce their meat consumption. Everybody, to some extent, reduce their meat consumption. And again, we see this interaction, which again, it's not quite where I wanted it to be. But it's not really according to our prediction, because I was imagining that the trend, it's meal information, helps you in this goal, would actually be much more, would show the most reduction. I would imagine this to be a much more pronounced difference. But instead we see this interaction such that those who receive the instruction in the industry do, in fact, worked with the plan that they've made. But as I said, this is not really the objective measure. Right now, I'm still working with analyzing the diary that people have answered, what kind of meat or beef they ate in any meal, and we're going to have 2 days before the manipulation and 2 days after the manipulation, which we'll be able to control for past consumption and stuff like that. But that is multi-level modeling that I'm hoping to be a bit more proficient in. So other than this aspect of objective intake, there are also the possible moderators that we're looking at. Numeracy, which were a couple of questions of kind of intuitive mathematical abilities. And also we have political affiliation and some pre-existing values that I would love to look at. But in next studies, there are a couple of different ways I'm thinking of taking this. On the one end, there is a more robust longitudinal study, which would go in line with kind of health psychology standards of making such interventions, which is like a 5-week intervention, which gives you enough time to test baseline measures. And also to produce a certain consumer behavior paradigm in which maybe will construct actual data labels, so you could see in the back of your product the water footprint percentage of a certain budget that you maybe want to set to yourself as an environmentalist, or the amount of CO2 that is embedded in the product. And in addition, another direction to take is looking at other high-impact behavior and see whether this presentation of individual data could combat the usual kind of helplessness that people experience when they think about their actions versus the environments. So yeah, I'd like to thank Dr. Jason Plaks. Dr. Lee Xu is here. Thank you very much. And Dr. Seuss for the title.
Time for a few questions.